The year was 1882, and in the town of Millstone, Colorado, the afternoons were measured in dust and quiet industry. But behind King's General Store lay a secret. Heartleaf Garden. It was nothing more than two weathered benches, a bird bath chipped by a long-ago hailstorm, and a sprawling oak whose leaves whispered secrets to the wind. For the townsfolk, it was a place to read the paper. For Clara Bell, it was a sanctuary. Perched on one of those benches, Clara had a sketchbook balanced on her knees, her fingers stained with charcoal. For 20 minutes, her world had narrowed to the man sitting across the garden. He was a study in contrast to Millstone's ranch hands and farmers. Where they wore functional denim and trail-worn leather, he wore a rust-colored waistcoat that caught the sun like an ember. His boots, though practical, held a polish that spoke of care, and his shoulders were set with a posture that suggested authority, even in repose. He wasn't just sitting. He was occupying space with a quiet intention that Clara felt compelled to capture. Her pencil flew across the page, a line for the strong angle of his jaw, a shadow for the concentration etched between his brows. He was reading a leather-bound book, turning the pages with a reverence she found captivating. He'd flinch almost imperceptibly when a line of poetry struck him, a small crease deepening on his forehead. Clara had been counting the seconds, not out of obsession, but out of an artist's focus. 36 minutes. Her hand did not stop. She didn't know his name was Everett Reed. She didn't know he'd ridden in from the sprawling Reed Ranch, 3 miles out, after another silent, simmering argument with his father. She didn't know he'd come to the garden seeking a quiet that didn't demand anything of him. All she saw was a man who looked, in his unguarded solitude, strangely beautiful. When she finished, she stared at the portrait. Her heart thudded a nervous rhythm against her ribs. It was good. It was more than good. It was the first thing she'd drawn in months that felt alive. She had captured not just his likeness, but the quiet strength and the profound loneliness that lived just beneath the surface. The safe choice was to tuck it away, to keep this secret for herself. But a courage, forged from months of her own loneliness, propelled her to her feet. She approached him as one would a skittish animal, slowly, openly, her shadow finally falling across his page. He looked up, and his eyes, the color of rich coffee, met hers. They were steady, intelligent, and for a moment, simply curious. "Excuse me," Clara said, her voice softer than she intended. I drew this." He closed his book, placing a finger between the pages to mark his place, and accepted the sheet of paper. His gaze scanned the lines, and she saw his eyes widen, his breath catch. He was seeing himself through her eyes, and the recognition was a physical thing. "My God," he whispered. Then he stood. So abruptly his book slipped to the grass. Before she could react, he pulled her into a brief, startling embrace, the sketch crinkling between them. He released her just as quickly, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. "This is remarkable. You've made me look like someone worth knowing." Clara, who had grown accustomed to the heat of shame, felt a different warmth bloom in her chest. When was the last time someone had held her without wanting something in return? "How much?" he asked, his voice earnest. "Name your price." "Nothing," she said, and she meant it. A genuine smile touched her lips for the first time in a year. "Your reaction paid the bill in full." They talked as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. He told her about the relentless demands of the ranch, the weight of being the eldest son, and the book of poetry that had been his grandfather's, his only escape. She told him about making charcoal from hearth ashes and practicing sketches in the margins of her father's old sermons, the only canvas she'd ever been allowed. When the light began to fade, he stood. "I'm Everett Reed," he said, rolling the sketch with immense care and tucking it inside his vest. "I'm staying at Mrs. Higgins' boarding house on Main Street, room 5. He looked at her, his expression open and hopeful. "If you'd like to continue this conversation, I would like that very much." Clara walked back to her own small room, the ghost of his embrace still warming her skin, something fragile and new fluttering in her heart. It felt dangerously like hope. 3 evenings later, at precisely 7 o'clock, a knock sounded on her door. Mrs. Higgins, a woman who governed her boarding house with the stern morality of a battlefield general, had clearly approved his visit, for he was standing there, holding a small bunch of wildflowers. Her room was narrow, but scrupulously clean. A worn Bible sat on the bedside table, but the walls were alive with her art. Sketches of windmills turning against vast skies, children leaping across the creek, hands clasped in prayer. They sat at her small table, the air between them humming with a newfound intimacy. "You mentioned your father wrote sermons," Everett ventured, accepting a cup of tea. "Is he a preacher?" The question, so gently asked, was a blow nonetheless. Clara studied the fine crack in her saucer. "He was, Reverend Abraham Bell, of Oak Creek, Kansas." She took a steadying breath. "I haven't seen him in over a year." What happened? She had rehearsed 100 softer versions of the story, tales that sanded down the edges of her foolishness. But under the patient weight of Everett's gaze, the unvarnished truth tumbled out. "I was 22 and believed I knew the shape of love," she began, her voice flat. "A man named Thomas Beale sat in our parlor, said all the right things, walked me home from socials. One night, he said he had something important to ask me. I thought he meant to propose." She stood and walked to the window, unable to say this while looking at him. "He didn't propose. He took, and I let him. I believed his promises." She turned then, bracing for the disgust, the judgment. What she found in Everett's face was a quiet, cold fury, a rage not directed at her, but on her behalf. "What kind of a man," Everett said, his voice low and edged like a blade, "does that? And what kind of father blames his daughter for a predator's sin?" "The kind who worships at the altar of reputation," Clara replied, her shoulders slumping. "He gave me $50 and a one-way ticket west, told me not to come home." She sat down again, forcing a smile. "But that's enough of my past. You said you quarreled with your family." Everett stared into the depths of his teacup. "My brother, William, is 30. He's been courting a wonderful woman, Sarah, for 2 years. He asked for our parents' blessing to marry." A humorless smile touched his lips. "They refused. They say I must marry first. An old, foolish tradition. The eldest son weds before the younger, lest the town think there's something wrong with me." "And you told them it was nonsense." "I did. My father called it a dereliction of duty. My mother wept. William thinks I'm just being stubborn." He looked up, and his eyes met hers. "Perhaps I am." Clara reached across the table and covered his hand with her own. "Or perhaps you're the only one refusing to confuse tradition with truth and appearances with love." In the stillness of that small room, they saw their own reflections in each other's eyes, two souls made small by the expectations of others, suddenly feeling the vast, terrifying expanse of their own potential. And in that quiet understanding, a bond was forged, not in grand ballrooms or with public declarations, but in the shared language of past pain and a fragile, blooming hope. But the world of Millstone was not ready for a love that defied its rules. The storm of scandal and family duty was gathering on the horizon, and it would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. This was only the beginning of their story. Subscribe now, and join us next time for the next part, where a single choice in the shadow of a thunderstorm will change everything. A rhythm settled over the next few weeks, a melody so sweet and unfamiliar it felt like a secret. Everett arrived each evening at Clara's door, the scent of hay and horseflesh clinging to his clothes, a tangible reminder of the world he navigated by day to return to her by night. Sometimes they walked the length of Main Street, her hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm, a public declaration that sent whispers skittering through the town like dry leaves. Sometimes they returned to their bench in Heartleaf Garden, where he would read aloud from his book of poetry and she would sketch, her charcoal capturing the way his mouth moved around the words. Mrs. Higgins, the boarding house keeper, watched their courtship with a hawk's eye and a tongue sharp enough to fill at a man's reputation. "A gentleman caller is one thing, Miss Bell," she'd remarked one evening, her gaze sweeping over Everett's retreating form. "But consistency breeds speculation. Mind you don't give this town a story it doesn't need." Once, such a warning would have frozen Clara's blood. Now, she found the fear had lost its teeth. The chorus of other people's opinions was fading, replaced by the steady, sure sound of her own heartbeat when she was with Everett. One afternoon, the sky, which had been a placid blue all day, began to bruise at the edges. By the time Everett knocked on her door, a low rumble of thunder was echoing in the distance. "We should make this a short visit," he said, his hair already damp with the first fat drops of rain. A storm is coming. They had only just sat down when the heavens split open. Rain lashed against the window pane in a furious horizontal sheet, and the world outside dissolved into a gray blur. A flash of lightning lit the room in a sudden, ghostly white, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that shook the very foundations of the building. "I should go," Everett said, rising, his voice hesitant. "Mrs. Higgins will count getting caught in a downpour as a character flaw." Clara went to the window, drawing the curtains against the tempest. "Mrs. Higgins is visiting her sister in Denver for the week," she said, her voice calm, "and you'll drown before you make it 100 yards from the porch." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thick with the charge of the storm, and something else entirely, something potent and unspoken. They sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the only place to sit, the space between them humming with a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. "Clara," Everett began, his voice a low rumble that rivaled the thunder. It was filled with a question he was too honorable to ask, a desire he was too careful to impose. She turned to him, her gaze steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. She thought of Thomas Beale, of the shame that had been a cloak forced upon her shoulders. Then she looked at Everett, at the reverence in his eyes, the patience in his hands. "I know what happened to me before," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet clear as crystal in the small room. "And I know that with you, I am not afraid. I am not ashamed." "Are you certain?" he asked, his hand coming up to cradle her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek with an agonizing tenderness. Her answer was not in words. It was in the space she closed between them, in a first kiss that was nothing like what she had known. This was not a taking, not a conquest. It was a question and an answer, a surrender and a claim all at once. It was slow and searching, a conversation held in the silent language of breath and touch. He touched her not as a man claiming a prize, but as a pilgrim at a shrine. His hands were calloused from ranch work, yet his touch was feather-light, tracing the line of her collarbone, the curve of her waist, as if memorizing her geography. And she, who had learned to hide her body, to see it as a source of sin, found herself answering with a joy that was almost terrifying in its intensity. She was not a passive recipient. She was a willing participant, discovering a power in her own vulnerability. When he paused, his breath ragged against her skin, to ask, "Is this all right?" She didn't just say yes. She laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated freedom, and pulled him back to her. They learned each other in the silver flash of lightning and the deep, resonant dark that followed. There was no hurry, only a patient, awestruck discovery. He worshipped the stretch of her flank, the sensitive hollow of her throat. She marveled at the solid strength of his back, the surprising softness of his mouth. There were no ghosts in that room, no echoes of past betrayals. There was only the present, the astonishing reality of being fully seen, fully known, and, most miraculously, fully cherished. Afterward, the storm softened to a steady, soothing hiss on the roof. They lay tangled together in the cool linen, the world outside washed clean. "I should feel guilty," Everett murmured into her hair, his arm a heavy, comforting weight across her waist. "My mother would have a case of the vapors. My father would disown me on principle." Clara shifted to look at him. "Do you feel guilty?" He considered it, his dark eyes searching hers. Then he leaned forward and kissed her, soft and lingering. "No," he breathed. "It feels like my entire life. I've been riding in the wrong direction, and I've only just now found my way home." They drifted in and out of sleep, wrapped in a cocoon of newfound intimacy. Near dawn, he woke her with kisses that started at her shoulder and traveled, with deliberate slowness, to her mouth. She blushed in the dim light, pushing at his chest playfully. "Good heavens, Mr. Reed, the sun isn't even up. The milkman will be making his rounds." He threw his head back and laughed, a full, unguarded sound that seemed to shake the last of the storm's gloom from the room. The embarrassment she might have felt transformed, in that moment, into a shared, secret joke, a touchstone of happiness they would carry for the rest of their lives. The morning after the storm, everything was the same, yet irrevocably changed. They were still Clara Bell, the artist with a past, and Everett Reed, the heir to a ranch and a legacy of expectation. But now they were a unit. They had moved the furniture of their souls into the same room. The real world, however, had not been sleeping. News arrived on a crisp Tuesday, delivered by a tight-lipped William Reed on their doorstep. "Father has forbidden it," William said, his face grim. "He says if I marry Sarah without his blessing, I am no longer his son." He looked from his brother to Clara, his eyes pleading. "He says your rebellion, Everett, has poisoned the family's sense of duty." The confrontation at the Reed Ranch was not a shouting match. It was colder, harder. Silas Reed stood by the great stone hearth, a man carved from granite and tradition. "Your brother has lost his mind," Silas announced, his voice like the crack of ice. "And this is your doing. Your obstinance drags our name through the mud of scandal." Everett stood his ground, Clara's presence a tangible strength at his back. "William's happiness is no scandal," he countered, his voice level. "And a name isn't tarnished by love, Father. It's tarnished by pride." "Honor!" Silas roared, the word echoing in the vast room. "Duty to your elders, respect for the way things are done. That is what holds a family, a town, together." "The only shame I see here," Everett said, and as he spoke, a final internal piece of himself seemed to click into place, solid and unshakable, "is in a father who would use his love as a weapon to forbid his sons." That evening, back in the sanctuary of her room, Clara sat by the window, an embroidery hoop in her hands, a new skill, a potential new source of income. The door opened and Everett entered. He carried with him the bone-deep resolve of a man who has finished a long and difficult calculation and arrived at the only possible answer. He didn't get down on one knee. Instead, he pulled a small velvet box from his vest pocket and simply held it out to her, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "Marry me, Clara Belle," he said, the words simple, direct, and devastatingly sure. "This Saturday, in the same ceremony as William and Sarah. Let this entire town see what love looks like when it stops asking for permission." He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was a simple, elegant band of gold. "I love your artist's hands," he continued, his voice softening. "I love the fire in your soul that refuses to be extinguished. I love the future I see when I look at you. We will make a life, Clara, a life that answers to no one but its own heart." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but they were tears of a joy so profound it felt like healing. "My parents, they won't come. They meant what they said." "Then we will begin a new family," he said without a moment's hesitation. "A new branch on the old tree." She stood, took his face in her hands, and kissed him with all the love, all the hope, all the fierce, defiant faith that was in her. "Yes," she said against his lips. The word was a vow, a promise, a beginning. A double wedding, a public defiance. For Clara and Everett, it was the triumphant culmination of a love forged in trust. But for the town of Millstone, and for the rigid Silas Reed, it was a declaration of war. A happy ending was not something they would be permitted so easily. The vows were spoken, but the real battle for their future was just beginning. The foundation of their new life is about to be tested. Don't miss the next part, do. Ean o Waichi. The stunning conclusion, where the past returns with a vengeance and the strength of their love will face its ultimate trial. Subscribe now and make sure you're here for the final chapter. The whitewashed church at the edge of Millstone had never seen a wedding like it. On a Saturday so bright, the very air seemed to sparkle. Two couples stood on the same plank floor, 4 feet apart, bound not just by matrimony, but by a shared, quiet rebellion. The pews were packed. The absence of Clara's family and the stony silence from the Reed family's front row created a palpable void in the room. But as Reverend Wickham spoke the vows, the space was filled by the sheer, radiant force of the love between Everett and Clara and William and Sarah. When Everett kissed his bride, it was not a chaste peck, but a slow, tender seal of a profound promise, a sight that made half the congregation sigh and the other half avert their eyes, fanning themselves vigorously. The celebration in the social hall was boisterous, a temporary shield against the outside world. Between toasts, William clapped his brother on the back. "So, big brother, ready to be the respectable married man of the Reed family?" Everett watched his new wife, who was already sketching the whirl of dancers as if trying to capture the very sound of the fiddle on paper. A soft smile touched his lips. "I'll settle for happy, Will. I'll settle for happy." Their secret house on Pine Street was a sanctuary. 3 rooms, a narrow garden, and a view of the mountains that felt like a promise. They fit into the bed that first night like 2 pieces of a long, separated puzzle, finally whole. At gray dawn, Everett sat on the edge of the mattress, pulling on his work boots. "The ranch," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the inevitable confrontation. "I have to go. Father's temper will be a force of nature today." Clara's hand found his back, her touch a steadying anchor. "Will you be safe?" He turned and kissed her brow, his love for her a solid, unassailable thing in his chest. "I have all the safety I need right here." Marriage became Clara's true awakening. Her art, once confined to margins and secret sketchbooks, now sprawled boldly across their kitchen table. Everett, whose word in town now carried the dual weight of his name and his defiant integrity, introduced her to Mr. Aldridge at the Fine Arts and Stationery shop. The Easterner, with his spectacles and soft hands, saw the raw talent in her lines and gave her the front window. Within a month, her drawings of local landscapes and stark, honest portraits were the talk of Millstone. Commissions began to arrive, tied with silk ribbon. The very talent that had once exiled her now built her a throne. But life, in its relentless turn, soon presented a new commission. By late autumn, Clara noticed a familiar, unsettling queasiness and a strange, metallic taste in her mouth. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled at odd hours. Tessa Holloway, a relentlessly kind woman with 2 babies of her own, diagnosed her over tea one afternoon, her eyes twinkling. "You're with child, Clara Reed," Tessa announced, leaving no room for argument. "Best tell that handsome husband of yours before he figures it out himself, or I will." Clara laughed until the laughter turned to happy, bewildered tears. That evening, she perched on the arm of Everett's chair, stole his book, and blurted out the news. He looked up at her, his eyes shimmering, and simply said, "I know." He had already guessed: the sudden naps, the tears over a beautiful sunset, the hope so immense he hadn't dared to speak its name. The pregnancy was a journey of wonder and grueling work. Winter brought relentless nausea, spring brought tears and a baffling craving for pickled eggs at midnight. And by July, swollen and exhausted, Clara lay on the sofa with a cool cloth on her forehead and declared, "This baby needs to come out, now." "Dr. Finch says any day," Everett soothed, fanning her with yesterday's newspaper. "Any day is a lifetime," she snapped, the heat and discomfort shortening her temper to a wick. "Women have been doing this since there were women." "Fair," he said, hands raised in surrender. "But you're not women. You're Clara, and you're magnificent." Labor came that night, a brutal 18-hour tempest that taught her the stories always leave out the edges. Dr. Finch murmured worriedly about complications. Tessa was a rock, her hands steady and voice calm. Everett paced the small confines of their home like a caged wolf, his face ashen with a fear no ranch disaster had ever inspired. "I can't," Clara gasped, her body racked with a pain that seemed to have no end. "God, Everett, I can't." "You can," Tessa said, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. "And you will. You're made of stronger stuff than you know." As the sun bled into the horizon on the second day, it was over, and in its place lay a tiny, perfect girl with a shock of Everett's dark hair and Clara's own stubborn chin. They named her Clara, after Everett's grandmother, who had once told him that true strength was always gentled by kindness. "I am never," Clara whispered, her body spent but her heart full to bursting, doing that again. 18 months later, she was staring at her breakfast eggs, her stomach staging another rebellion. Tessa's laughter this time was downright wicked. "Well, tell the good doctor his prescription worked a little too well." The second pregnancy was steadier, if harder, chasing a toddling Clara while carrying her sibling. Their son, Ben, arrived in the summer, loud and sturdy from the start. They named him for Everett's grandfather, a man who believed the work done quietly was its own reward. 2 children in 2 years. Their home became a symphony of first laughs, fretful nights, and the profound moment Everett cried because Alara's tiny hand had curled around his finger and held on like a promise. Even Silas Reed, his heart hardened by tradition, found it difficult to entirely dismiss the sturdy, beautiful family his son had built. A grudging truce, paved by chubby baby hands, began to form. The years that followed were not a straight line of happiness, but a woven tapestry of work and wonder, small griefs, and great joys. Clara grew into a flint-bright young woman, inheriting her mother's artist's eye and her father's quiet, unyielding patience. Ben was steadiness incarnate, content to mend what was broken and leave the loud dreams to others. And then, in the turn-of-the-century summer of 1900, a man named Barrett Ellison rode into Millstone. He arrived on a fine blood bay horse, his clothes cut from an Eastern tailor, his smile a weapon of polished charm. His father had bought land east of town, and Barrett had come to survey, to hire, to impress. He first saw Clara in Aldridge's shop, where she was now arranging her own watercolors. He stopped dead, not at the sight of her, which was striking enough, but at the painting in the window, a sunrise over the Rockies that seemed to bleed light onto the glass. "This is extraordinary," he said, his voice cultured, his attention absolute. "Who is the artist?" "I am," Clara said, wiping a smudge of paint from her hand. His smile shifted, transforming from casual appreciation to focused admiration. He began to visit daily, his conversations not filled with empty flattery, but with intoxicating ideas. He spoke of Parisian salons, of electric lights, of galleries where a single canvas could command a fortune. "A talent like yours is wasted here," he said one afternoon, not unkindly, but with a devastating certainty. "You belong in rooms where critics argue and weep over a single brushstroke." "My life is here," Clara replied, though the words felt smaller than they once had. "My family." "They can still be your family," he countered smoothly, just from a more enlightened address. The seeds he planted were small, patient. Clara began to see the familiar patterns of her mother's commission work as a cage. The town's rhythms felt like a loop. Barrett's world sounded like a key turning in a lock. He proposed over dessert at the Pioneer Hotel, the crystal and linen a world away from her kitchen. "It wouldn't be proper," she murmured, the ghost of her mother's past a faint whisper in her ear. "Then marry me first," he said, as if it were the simplest, most logical solution. Stunned by the speed and the sheer scale of the future he offered, Clara heard herself whisper, "Yes." The wedding was modest, the haste explained by impending business back east. Barrett was an attentive, almost practiced husband. He praised her uninhibited nature, her passion. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, she saw a look in his eyes, a hungry, possessive gleam that seemed less about her and more about the story she represented. The beautiful wildflower artist from a dusty Colorado town. The hairline cracks appeared quickly. Strange men visited their rented rooms, sharing laughter that felt exclusionary. One afternoon, climbing the stairs, she heard Barrett's voice, too loud, too boastful. "Pure as the mountain snow when I found her, and eager. You wouldn't believe the fire." Clara pushed the door open, her face a mask of calm, her heart a block of ice in her chest. Barrett flushed, introduced the man as a business associate. The lies were clumsy, the arrogance plain. That night, when she confronted him, he soothed her with soft words and softer touches, making the questions seem foolish until they dissolved under the weight of his calculated affection. It was a cycle, subtle and degrading. Then, one morning, she found it. A note on the table, clipped to a stack of banknotes, a month's wages, a polite, condescending goodbye. "Called back east on urgent business. Will always cherish your sweetness. You should return to your family, as small towns are unkind to adventurous young women." The carefully chosen words were a masterpiece of cruelty. He had not just left. He had framed his abandonment as her failure. Clara let out a single broken laugh, and then the dam broke. The tears were not just for the betrayal, but for her own gullibility. By the time she made it to her parents' door on Pine Street, the stories were already slithering through Millstone, saloon to seamstress, laced with intimate, believable details. Clara opened the door and, without a word, pulled her drowning daughter into the safe harbor of her arms. Clara told them everything, the story, a wretched echo of a pain Clara knew all too well. Everett stood in the doorway, his face a thundercloud. "I'll find him," he said, the words cold and deadly. "He's gone, Papa," Clara said, her voice hollow. "And even if you did, what then? I'm the one who has to live here with their whispers." Clara stroked her daughter's hair, her touch conveying a strength that spanned generations. Then we build you back, she said, her voice firm. Just like we did before. We know how. On Sunday, when the minister made a veiled suggestion about public confession, Everett Reed stood up in the middle of the service. The sound of his boots on the wooden floor was like a hammer fall. Every head turned. My daughter, his voice boomed, clear and unyielding, owes this congregation nothing. A scoundrel lied. If any man here has a problem with that, we can step outside and discuss it. The silence was absolute. No one moved. Aldridge, to his credit, welcomed Clara back with a stiff nod and a softer voice. Some customers avoided her. Others looked at her with a new, painful understanding. She began to paint again, not the pretty sunsets for tourists, but landscapes that breathed with a raw, untamed power, and portraits that didn't flatter, but forgave. The whispers dulled. Time did its work. Men came courting and were politely, firmly declined. Elara learned the shape of caution and wore it not as a shackle, but as armor. Years later, sitting on the porch as the mountains darkened into silhouettes, Elara asked the question that had lingered for a long time. Do you regret it? The scandal? The way they spoke of you? Clara looked across at Everett, their shared history passing between them in a single glance. She smiled, slow and certain. I regret the hurt, she said, but I have never, for a single moment, regretted the road that brought me to your father, or the woman that road forced me to become. Elara nodded, finally understanding. Some storms aren't meant to be outrun. They are meant to be outlasted, with family on either side of you and the memory of a shared joke. A milkman in the dawn, tucked in your pocket like a talisman. The Meriwether Reeds sat in the gathering dark, a living testament that love is not a shield against pain, but a tool for mending it. That honor is not a reputation, but a choice you make every morning, and that a story told against you never, ever gets the last line. 3 generations. One unbreakable lesson. That character is not defined by the storms that hit us, but by the foundations we build to withstand them. From Clara's shattered past to Elara's reclaimed future, this family proved that the greatest legacy is not a spotless name, but a resilient heart. If this tale of love, loss, and fierce redemption found a home in you, then your journey with us doesn't have to end here. Subscribe to the channel for more sagas from the frontier, where the landscape is wild, but the human heart is wilder still. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Elara's shoes? And if you know someone who needs this reminder of their own strength, share this story forward, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can be is a safe harbor for someone else.